Welcome to another episode of the Football Analytics Show. My name is Ed Fang, your host, and on this episode, I'm thrilled to have Matt Freedman on the show. He is the head of betting at Matthew Berry Fantasy Life, and he writes the Betting Life newsletter. Matt, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ed. It's always fun to chop it up with you, and especially like this time of year. You know, like the Super Bowl menu, we have props that we would never see at any other time in the year. So it's a lot of surface area for us to be able to talk about and to hopefully find exploitable opportunities.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to digging into that. The Football Analytics Show is brought to you by the Power Ranks Sports Betting newsletter. Looking for some action on any given weekend? This is the free service for you, as 5 Nugget Saturday is my curated list of tips in analytics. To sign up for free, go to thepowerrank.com. Matt, is there a Super Bowl prop that you would be willing to share your process on?
Yeah. Okay. I have a question for you. Do you want me to highlight a sort of like quote unquote normal prop, or do you want me to go a little bit off the board with one that we might not see on an ordinary game?
Sure. I mean, I think we have time for both if you'd be willing to do both.
Sure. Okay. So let's start with this one is a little bit weird, but fantasy points, specifically DraftKings points. Patrick Mahomes under 21 and a half DraftKings points. And I bet this, I put it in the Fantasy Life bet tracker at minus 110. It is now minus 140. I still think it is bettable at that number. And I will say like this, I like to highlight it because I feel like it's representative of the types of opportunities we have for the Super Bowl. Not always do we see fantasy point props for games. But for a game like the Super Bowl, books will kind of expand their prop menu and they will venture into waters where they are not as adept. And so as books have gotten better, certainly at pricing props, but they're still not as good at pricing props as they are pricing spreads and totals. So as problematic as they might be with their processes for just normal, like quote unquote, normal player props, they are like all the more vulnerable with something like fantasy point props, where they have like no idea really how to do this. And I would say like the typical like fantasy degenerate, this is an area where that person actually has an edge. And if we look at what Patrick Mahomes has done as a fantasy producer in the regular season, 16 games played, sat out week 18. In his 16 games, he went over 21 and a half DraftKings points in just 3 of those 16 games. He averaged 19.3 fantasy points in those games. And then in the postseason, he's had 18.6, 18.5, and 15.1. So he's fallen significantly short of the 21 and a half number here in the like vast super majority of his games. I have this projected at 18.6. The last time that Patrick Mahomes went or hit 21 and a half or went over that number was week 7, which is like a lifetime ago. That was against the Chargers, 424 yards, 4 touchdowns passing against the Chargers. That is not at all the kind of offense that the Chiefs have at this point. And the 49ers certainly aren't the Chargers. In the 18 games that they played this season against starting quarterbacks, so taking out week 18 when they were resting, the Rams were resting, in their 18 representative games this year, they allowed only 5 quarterbacks to go over 21 and a half DraftKings points. So like, I know that this is a sort of off the board kind of prop in terms of like what people normally look at. It's not available in every state. It's a state by state basis on this, but this is definitely one of the favorite props that is on the board. Patrick Mahomes under 21 and a half DraftKings points.
Excellent, Matt. I don't do too much fantasy, so can you give me a sense for like, is 21 just an outlier, fantastic quarterback fantasy performance?
No, it's like a number that would have been appropriate for Patrick Mahomes in previous seasons. But this year it's just a little bit different because he's not passing the ball as much. When he is passing, he's not going as far down the field. He's not throwing as many touchdowns. And the big thing is that with DraftKings, they have a bonus that a quarterback gets 3 extra points if he passes for at least 300 yards. And that is just a number that we are not seeing Mahomes get to nearly as often this year as he has in previous years. So you put all that together, and it's not that 21 and a half is like a great number. It's just that the Chiefs aren't operating their offense in a way that requires Patrick Mahomes to put up points like that for them to win games.
Excellent. Matt, you said you had a more conventional prop that you want to talk about?
Yeah, this one, I'm still going to make it a little bit weird, but uh, Christian McCaffrey, the anytime touchdown market. Now, if you just kind of look at the anytime touchdown market on its own, a couple of things. One, this tends to be an overjuiced market where I think for the vast majority of players in this market, there isn't value. But this year for Christian McCaffrey, I think the market hasn't been as aggressive or as priced as highly as it should be. So for Christian McCaffrey right now, you can find him. Let me just make sure I'm giving the most up to the date number here. With Christian McCaffrey, you can find him anywhere from like minus 210 to minus like 250 as like a reasonable range for him to score an anytime touchdown. And I have this priced like at minus 275. So I still think that there's value with Christian McCaffrey. And like, I know that is a ridiculously high number, like minus 275, but I'll just say like Christian McCaffrey, he scores a touchdown basically every time that he plays. And it's because the 49ers are really efficient at turning red zone trips into touchdowns. And a lot of that is because McCaffrey is a really good goal line back. He's had the most red zone opportunities of any player in the NFL this year. And so I think just Christian McCaffrey on his own to score a touchdown, I think it's bettable up to minus 250. At DraftKings right now, it's minus 215. And for markets, like the touchdown markets, there can be a wide discrepancy. So you always want to, be sure that you're getting the best line there. But I will say, if you don't want to be in a situation where you're laying like minus 215, minus 250, even if there's value there, I think that you can also single game parlay this with the under on McCaffrey's scrimmage yards. And I will say I have the under projected. So I still think that there's value there on that anyway with going under on Christian McCaffrey. I haven't projected for, sorry, let me make sure I'm giving the most recent projection I have here. I haven't projected for 117.7 scrimmage yards. So I think that there's value on the under of 130 and a half scrimmage yards. And I think there's even enhanced value in pairing those two together because there's inverse correlation in how the books put those things together. And it makes sense, like a guy he literally can't score a touchdown without getting at least 1 yard on that play. So touchdowns and yards are correlated, but with Christian McCaffrey, there's really a very loose correlation between touchdowns and yards. Like Christian McCaffrey could have a quote unquote sort of like awesome game for every other player, which would maybe be just like a typical game for him in which he scores 100 or which he has 120 yards and he could still score a touchdown in that game without going over. Like what matters for McCaffrey is not the number of scrimmage yards he has in terms of whether he scores a touchdown. What matters for him is just the number of times the 49ers get near the goal line. And that is like just not at all correlated with the number of yards that McCaffrey has. So another way of thinking about this is that McCaffrey, he had under 130 and a half scrimmage yards in 8 of his 18 games this year. So it's not quite 50%, but like that number is, pretty close to like the median of what we would expect from McCaffrey. And in all but one of those 8 games, he scored a touchdown. So like McCaffrey can basically, he can go under this number and still have a very good chance of scoring a touchdown. And if you parlay the anytime touchdown and the under of 130 and a half scrimmage yards, you can get, I bet this at plus 219 at FanDuel. And so I think there's value in doing that. And of course, like, the market changes, you might not be able to get a number that good, but I think anything above plus 200 is still bettable with that general idea of parlaying McCaffrey anytime touchdown with the under on the scrimmage yards.
And you like the value in that because the books are factoring in some correlation that you think doesn't exist.
Correct.
Because it's Christian McCaffrey.
Yeah, absolutely. That is like the real sort of like secret sauce of that bet. Like the books are pricing it as if there is much more correlation than I think there actually is.
Matt, you've talked a lot about your quantitative predictions already in this segment. Can you give us a sense for how those work and whether they are just yours or whether you work with a quantitative team at Fantasy Life?
Yeah, so I have my own set of player projections, and it's like a very kind of top down process, where I know what the spread is, I know what the total is. That gives us the implied point total for a team, and then we have a sense of the number of plays that a team is going to run, and you have a sense of the run pass ratio and the efficiency that a team has. So it's very kind of top down, but then I will do some tweaks here and there, but I try to automate as much of that process as I can. And then that is separate from the process that our team does at Fantasy Life. And that process is managed by Dwayne McFarland, who is like a super sharp fantasy guy, and he manages all of that with James McCool, who's a data scientist, and it's a similar approach, but I would say that their process is much more hands-on and also probably just sharper than mine, because mine is just like the one-man band and I'm trying to get it just sort of like quick and dirty, close enough to accurate, whereas Dwayne is laboring over the exact splits of everything and really kind of digging into matchups much more than I am. But so we have two different sets of projections, and you can find those both in our projections tool at Fantasy Life, and then you can also kind of click a button and have the aggregated projections that combine both of ours.
Excellent. And that projections tool you guys have for free, I think, right?
Oh, absolutely. Everything is free at Fantasy Life.
Excellent. How do you guys kind of work together and share ideas? I know you've only been there for a limited amount of time, but how does kind of the team work in general? Because you're mostly in charge of the Betting Life newsletter, and that's a little bit different. I mean, I guess you do props in there, but you're more interested in sides and totals as well. So maybe give me a sense for how the team at Fantasy Life works.
Yeah, so I'm, kind of like the flex player where I do some fantasy analysis. I got my start in fantasy, and because I still really like player props quite a bit, I think of sort of player props as like my version of fantasy. I still do a lot on the fantasy side, doing rankings and all of that. And I think increasingly the type of analysis that people do for fantasy and for sports betting is complementary and crossing over. So for me, there's really not all that much of a difference between the way that I think about, like if I'm looking at a game for fantasy or looking at a game for sports betting, it's all just kind of sports analysis. And I think a lot of the other contributors at Fantasy Life, even if they're kind of more strictly on the fantasy side or more on the sports betting side, like they kind of still have that same perspective. Like it's all just sort of football analysis in the way that you are looking at things. But we have Ian Hartitz, who is incredibly sharp. Especially on the fantasy side, Dwayne McFarland, who does projections. He's also incredibly sharp. He looks at utilization data in a way that I think is deeper and more nuanced than almost anyone else in the industry. And then on the sports betting side, we have Matt LaMarca and Jeff Ulrich, both of whom are pretty good bettors. And then, I mean, Ulrich, especially looking at like the underdog pick'em opportunities, he has just been crushing those this year. And so, like, we're kind of trying to cover all of the bases, but in the end, it's just sort of, it's sports analysis. And I think whether you're doing it from a fantasy perspective or a betting perspective, there's a lot of overlap.
Excellent. We should also talk a little bit about the game, Kansas City versus San Francisco. Are there any matchups that stand out to you that could really affect the outcome of the game?
Yeah, so we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, and like the obvious thing for the 49ers, when they have the ball, I expect them to be looking to exploit a pretty weak Chiefs run defense with Christian McCaffrey. There's really not much need to talk about that. I think what is much more intriguing is what the Chiefs will do when they have the ball, because they haven't been nearly as good on offense this year as they have historically. But we have seen Travis Kelce come on during the playoffs. Especially after resting in week 18 and getting a sort of de facto bye there. He looked great in the playoffs. He had a 30% target share. And then now entering the Super Bowl, he's coming off of another bye. And, I think obviously Isaiah Pacheco, running back for the Chiefs, he's going to be important. And I think the 49ers run defense is a little bit more exploitable than maybe some people think. But I think if the Chiefs are going to win, a lot of it is going to be because Travis Kelce was able to exploit a secondary that I think has been significantly diminished since they lost strong safety Talanoa Hufanga in week 11. So he's been on IR. And no one else is like Travis Kelce, but the two tight ends who are most like Kelce, who have played the 49ers since Hufanga has been out, Trey McBride, Sam Laporta, both of those guys really exploited the 49ers. McBride in week 15 had 11 targets, 102 yards receiving. Sam Laporta just recently in the NFC Championship game, 13 targets, 97 yards. I think this is a Travis Kelce type of game. And so I think specifically if people were looking at Kelce to be MVP or, anything like that, like it does make sense to me. Like I wouldn't bet the over on Kelce's like yardage prop. Like if Kelce goes off, I think he goes off in a pretty big way. So I'd be thinking about like the upside, the tail scenario of how to exploit that. But Kelce going against a rookie strong safety in Jair Brown, who's had to step up in Hufanga's absence. Like I think that is a significant mismatch. And like it would not surprise me if Kelce had like 15 targets in this game. Like I think this is a big Travis Kelce spot.
Excellent. Do you feel like San Francisco might move maybe their best cover guy, Javarius Ward, over on him or something like that to negate that matchup? Partially because, Kansas City, Rashee Rice is emerging as a rookie wide receiver, but otherwise on the outside, it's not the best unit out there.
Yeah, I would say no. And part of it is because that is not really the way that Steve Wilks does stuff. Like I think the matchup of Andy Reid versus Steve Wilks is a massive mismatch. Kyle Shanahan going against Steve Spagnuolo, like that's a toss up. Any one of those guys could win, but like they are fairly even. I've got a lot of respect for Spags. I do not have much respect for Steve Wilks. And part of it is that like Charvarius Ward, he has basically played his side of the field for the entire season. And so I don't see them, even though it's a Super Bowl, it's a big game, you have time to kind of maybe experiment and do things that you wouldn't ordinarily would. That is just not the way that Steve Wilks tends to do things. And given that we have seen Ward basically sequestered to his side of the field for the super majority of the season, I don't think we're going to see them really mix up anything. And I think it also means that Rashee Rice ends up having a pretty good situation as well. So he's the team's primary receiver in the slot. And then he plays on the outside when they're in, two tight end formations. And based on where he lines up, I think that means for about 3/4 of the game, he's going to be going against cornerback Diamador Lenore, who plays right corner in base formation and then slot in nickel packages. And that is also a pretty good matchup because it's been the guys who have some sort of like inside outside flexibility who have most exploited the 49ers since Lenore, who originally was playing just on the outside. And then he shifted into this hybrid role where he's outside and then plays in the slot when they go into nickel. It's been those guys that can play outside and inside at wide receiver who have really exploited the 49ers, like Christian Kirk, 104 yards, Zay Flowers, 72 yards and a touchdown. And then in the NFC Championship, Amon-Ra St. Brown, 11 targets, 87 yards. So I think we get Kelce going against Jair Brown. I think we get Rashee Rice matched up for like 3/4 of his routes against Diamador Lenore. I think those are matchups that both of those guys can win. So unless the 49ers do something that is uncharacteristic unless they change what they have been doing all year. I think that they are kind of setting themselves up for having their best cornerback in Charvarius Ward going against Justin Watson or Marquez Valdez-Scantling for most of the game. And it's just like, man, there's got to be a better way to play defense.
Probably. Just even hearing you say those words, Matt, kind of makes me chuckle. Travis Kelce is 17-1 at FanDuel. I looked at FanDuel because you tend to get better prices for MVP. Is that something that interests you?
You know, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because for all of the MVP markets, I would just rather create an SGP that approximates what needs to happen for that guy to win MVP. So let's say, for instance, if we were looking at like what needs to happen for Travis Kelce to win MVP, well, he probably, first of all, the Chiefs need to win. So that's number one. Secondly, he almost certainly needs to score a touchdown. On top of that,
Right.
he probably needs to go over 100 yards receiving. And then
Right.
I would say, finally, we need Patrick Mahomes not to have a great game. And so if you're kind of thinking of that general idea and putting that into an SGP, you know, you put Chiefs money line, Kelce anytime touchdown, Kelce on the alternate receiving yards of plus 100. And then I would say under Patrick Mahomes on his passing yardage total, which is like around 261 and a half, something like that. You put all that together and that's like, you know, 32-1, something like that. I would much rather bet that than Travis Kelce's 17-1.
That's fascinating. I bet you could probably find some Mahomes alt passing props, right? Like under 200 yards, maybe.
Yeah.
As well. Push that up a little bit. I think even with, you just said under Mahomes passing yards, you can imagine a scenario where people still vote Mahomes the MVP despite everything else happening, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is like,
it happened last year, you know?
Right, exactly. Kelce had a big game, and then Mahomes ended up winning MVP, right? Is that?
Yeah, I mean,
remember?
Mahomes, he had the 3 touchdowns, but Kelce didn't have a massive game, but Mahomes had 3 touchdowns and only like 180 yards passing. Like, it was a pretty lackluster MVP kind of performance from Mahomes. And like, if anyone else had managed a game that was kind of MVP caliber-esque, that person probably would have won instead of Mahomes.
Right. Matt, this year I've been doing interception props, and I looked at the primary markets for Patrick Mahomes and Brock Purdy, and I didn't see any value. But it's the Super Bowl, and as you mentioned, there's so many markets out there, and I have been able to find some markets that are related to interceptions with value, and that's been kind of cool. Do you see anything with Brock Purdy that with interceptions that you find interesting?
Yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts on this. So I'll just say, I am 100% certain that you have a much more sophisticated interception modeling system than I do, just kind of based on, what I've read at your site. And then, some of the contributions you made to the Betting Life newsletter this year. Your stuff was always incredibly sharp. So if you are saying that there's no value for Brock Purdy to throw an interception, that's something I should pay attention to. However, I have this projected as if he's pretty likely. Like I have this at minus 195 odds, which I'll just say like that feels high, but I think a chunk of that has to do with the matchups. Like in the situations this year where Brock Purdy, imploded, for lack of a better way of putting it. Those were the situations where Purdy was going against really good defensive coordinators. Think about what he did in Cleveland. That was a really subpar game. He was going against the Jim Schwartz defense. The next week he had 2 interceptions going against the Brian Flores blitz heavy defense with Minnesota. The 4 interception game that he had going against Mike McDonald and like his defense with the Ravens. I think that we could be, in Cincinnati, he threw 2 interceptions in that game going against Lou Anarumo. I think it could be a situation where, not that like I think that Brock Purdy is a bad quarterback because I think he's actually pretty underrated. But I could see this being a situation where he does throw an interception and is like actually kind of likely to throw an interception just based on the I don't know, just based on the quality of the defensive coordinator that he's going against. But so I have this priced maybe too aggressively at minus 195. What do you think is the right number for this?
Yeah, I just looked it up. I have Brock. I basically have 50-50 to throw a
Yeah.
pick, to not throw a pick. Partially that's because he's only projected to throw 31 times. That's obviously a factor in the model. And then in terms of how I actually project Purdy's interception rate, I actually look at how often he puts the ball in dangerous positions. And he's better than NFL average, but he's not Mahomes in his ability to not put the ball in dangerous positions. I would be interested in how you quantify like the defense or the coordinator or the scheme.
I mean, it's that is a really good question. It's a little bit kind of shooting from the hip in terms of the matchup, but then also like a team's ability to turn bad throws into interceptions. And then kind of trying to match up a little bit where I would say this might be an area where I'm getting into too much trouble, but maybe kind of disregarding a little bit what let's say like what Brock Purdy has done in soft matchups and maybe waiting a little too much what Purdy has done in those tougher matchups against really good defenses.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because you can definitely get that from the market data. I mean, I remember Brock Purdy being like plus 180, plus 200 to to um to throw a pick. So basically the markets are like, there's no way Brock Purdy is throwing a pick against Arizona
Yeah.
because the defense sucks, right? And so if
Yeah.
you factor some of that into it, and then you look at, I mean, I haven't seen, I haven't seen him strongly juiced to the under, uh, which in any of the markets. Yeah, it's been an interesting thing for me too because like there's definitely been some times this year where I've been on Purdy over, watched the game, and been like, "What the heck was I thinking?" Like he didn't even come close to throwing a pick, and certainly I don't remember what game it was, but it was certainly against the defense that probably like in Arizona or something like that, right?
It's yeah.
Um,
It's a little bit like a switch with him to where it's either like if he's playing an overmatched defense, he like stays remarkably clean the entire game. And if he's playing a defense that can put some pressure on him, kind of disguise what they're doing in their secondary, he puts the ball in danger multiple times a game. It's either hot or cold with him. And this just feels like, based on Spags, based on that defense, this feels like one of those games where we could see multiple bad throws. And then it's just a question, can the Chiefs turn one of those into an interception? I will say the market is much more on your side of this than on mine. Just in terms of how it's priced as if it's, pretty close to 50-50. I will say out of the domestic books, Caesars is the one that is the most in my direction, which at least makes me feel a little bit better. But yeah, the market is much more on your side than mine.
Well, I would actually say the market's moving towards you. I mean, I just pulled up DraftKings, which not necessarily the sharpest book out there, but they're minus 135 on the over right now. So, and that was certainly not what was there earlier this week. So I would say there's actually movement towards what you are saying.
Yeah. So we'll
All
we'll
right.
see how the market settles.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I find interesting is that in the Super Bowl, a minor market like interceptions thrown is all of a sudden like this major market where everyone, you know what I mean? Because the books are getting probably two-way action on some stuff so they can get a better price. That's definitely an interesting aspect of the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
We are a couple days away from kickoff. At this point, Matt, just wondered if you had any general insights into the market, maybe what to think about now, maybe, how much sharper is the market than past years on props? Any thoughts on those general ideas?
Yeah. So it's sharper, I think, generally than it used to be. But at the same time, there are so many more props that are offered for this game than what we used to see, and props that the books are not used to pricing. So I would say the market is sharper on, say, something like, Brock Purdy to throw an interception or something like that. Interception props, your basic player props, the market is now sharper than it used to be, in part because we have more, I'd say, market participants, more bettors, but the books are also better at pricing these markets because it's old hat for them. They now do it all the time, but they are also branching out into other types of props that they don't price all the time, or let me rephrase that they never price. Right, they're doing it just once for this game, and so I think Adam Levitan mentioned this on the last show that you did. Like, some of these props that are really weird, like the weirder the better, because like we as bettors, like, we're degenerate enough to actually do the research, to dive into this, to think about kind of the nuances of how something might unfold. And so still, like, yeah, it's sharper on the mainstream props, but on the edges where there are still like these kind of weird props, like for instance, at FanDuel, they have props on fastest ball carrier recorded using next gen stats. They have props on the longest air yards from a single reception, right? This is the first time that I've ever seen anything like that, or at least this year, right? Like, there's no way that this market is accurate. So there are lots of opportunities like that. And so I would just say, yeah, the weirder you can get with the props, and then, the further you can go into the research, probably the more opportunity you're going to have.
I think those props that you mentioned that are based on the tracking data are particularly interesting kind of from a public perspective, right? Because it's like, oh, hey, I bet so-and-so to have the fastest yards. And you see, like, let's say Pacheco, right? Like, you see him go on a breakaway and score a touchdown. And then you're like, oh, maybe I won my bet, right? But
right.
do you know? And the same thing with air yards. I guess you can guesstimate there, right? And you're in the same process for a bet like longest reception. But it's, again, I think that you got to kind of like scroll through NFL.com to figure out exactly what they track it as, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's an interesting sweat. Matt Freedman, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Football Analytics Show. Please let everyone know where they can get your work.
Yeah, you can get it for free at Fantasy Life. I have, during the football season, a fantasy article that comes out every week, highlights my favorite players for the week, have the fantasy rankings, have the player projections. Next year, we're going to have projections for sides, totals, and money lines for the NFL games. And then, of course, we have the Betting Life newsletter, which has been very NFL focused to this point. But as we transition out of football, it will be more focused on basketball, hockey, and then of course we do have baseball coming up as well, so be sure to keep an eye out for that.
Betting Life has been out 3 times a week during football season. What is your guys' plan as we transition out of that?
Yeah, still 3 times a week, focused on those other sports.
Wow, you're gonna be a busy man, Matt, as the writer of that.
You know what? Fortunately, I will not be writing nearly as much now that we are out of football season. So, yeah, Matt LaMarca, Jeff Ulrich, those guys actually know basketball, know hockey, and know baseball. They will be the guys carrying it during the football offseason. And I will be peppering in some NFL stuff, some draft stuff, here and there. So, but fortunately, I won't have to be the one carrying it.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Football Analytics Show. My name is Ed Fang, your host. After the Super Bowl, I'm not sure what the plan is for next week, but we will certainly have some episodes heading into March Madness, and I will talk to you again then.